Welcome to Season 3 of Adapt, Climate Change, and the Built Environment, where we interview professionals across the private and public sectors to discuss adapting the built environment to a changing climate. We believe that ensuring climate adaptation to extreme weather and evolving climate patterns needs us to re-examine what it takes to make our buildings, infrastructure, and communities resilient and adaptable so that our society can continue to thrive for years and decades to come. And with that, let's get started.
Hi, Monica.
Hello, Jessica.
So today is the final episode of our third season. We talked to Abby Ross, who is a serial entrepreneur. And I love entrepreneurs because I'm like the least entrepreneurial person I know. But I love how they're willing to take on big challenges. And she is exactly that. She loves to tackle seemingly impossible problems. She actually founded the Resiliency Company, which is what we're talking to her about, to take on the massive, massive challenge of helping humanity adapt to the challenges of climate risk. So, just that little thing. She developed the thesis for the company, the Resiliency Company, while serving as the CEO of For Good, which is a donor advised fund that has sent over $5 billion in donations to nonprofits. And it was there that she recognized that there are opportunities to rethink how communities recover from disasters.
Yeah, it was a fascinating conversation. We talked to her about what happens when those charitable donations after natural disasters come in, what the focus is on, and how we need to have a better approach for financing and building after disasters. She has seen up close how communities recover from these disasters and where there are deltas, gaps, challenges between the funds that are available for recovery and what a community actually needs to build back in a resilient manner after a natural disaster. We also talk about one of our favorite points, the financial benefits to incorporating climate resilience.
Yeah, I feel like this discussion really put an emphasis on something that underlies all of our conversations, but that I hadn't had the proper words to articulate until we talked to her. And I just read an article on this same idea. And the idea is this, is that natural hazards are inevitable. They always have been. And unfortunately, of course, as we talk about climate change, just making these hazards worse. They make them more frequent, they make them more intense and kind of more chaotic. You have more compound events, for example, of climate change. You have a bad storm followed by a heat wave when the electricity is out. So we can't stop all natural hazards, but natural disasters are not inevitable. The disaster part is the part that we have control over. We have the technology, knowledge, and ability to totally prevent or at least minimize many natural disasters. And we just need to have the collective will to do this. While there are actions we can take individually to both fight climate change and adapt to the realities of it that are here, climate change is such a big challenge that it does require collective action. We need governments at every level to work on this, along with businesses, charities, and individuals. We all have to work together to reduce carbon emissions and figure out how to adapt to the climate changes that are already here and ensure that we can be resilient to both the present and future risk that we're facing. Climate change is definitely scary, but ignoring it or denying it even exists won't make it go away. It will just make it worse while also reducing our ability to survive and thrive in this changing climate.
I think it's clear to our audience that our goal with this podcast has always been and will continue to be to help people realize that there are things we all can do at different levels. There are tools and resources and experts available to help us today tackle the massive challenges that climate change poses. We can both mitigate and adapt to climate change if we all work together. And with that, we close our third season and we'll see you in early 2026 for our fourth season.
Good morning, Abby. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have you with us. Can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a huge fan. So, my name is Abby Ross. I'm the CEO of the Resiliency Company, where our goal is to help humanity adapt to the changing conditions of increased climate risk. We do our work, which is to mobilize as much capital as possible into more climate resilient infrastructure. I came to this work because I was serving as the CEO of an organization called For Good, originally called Network for Good. And it's a large donor advised fund that has moved about $5 billion to nearly 500,000 charities across the country. And when I came in as CEO, I was analyzing some of the surges in our fund and noticed that we had these big surges in times of disaster. That's when, people were most likely to be generous and want to donate money. And that then led to what was 200 strategic discovery calls with anybody that would talk to me about trend and why that was. So it ranged from philanthropy and social impact to the climate community, into disaster response and preparedness, FEMA. And then that ultimately led to talking to insurance and reinsurance and public finance and private capital. And through that process, ultimately came to what is now the thesis of the Resiliency Company, which is, we need to adapt all of our infrastructure in this country to be prepared for, the climate risk and future ahead. Recognize that sending money to charity was an important part of that, but really wouldn't mobilize all the capital that is required for this thesis. So we spun out the Resiliency Company to do that work. And previous to this, I was an entrepreneur. So started my career in travel and then ended up in education. So have that experience of tackling, challenging problems and trying to go directly into the heart of some of challenging systems work, and, believe that this is, one of those incredible opportunities of our lifetime to be able to change the way a system operates.
How long has this resiliency company been around for?
So we have been cooking on this idea for, a couple years within the walls of For Good, but we officially launched in September of last year at Climate Week.
Fantastic. And the website is great. You have a ton of great information. I love the Epicenter. What's there and who's that for?
Great question. Glad you find it a valuable resource. When we launched Resiliency Company, we, kind of treated the Epicenter as a place to start publishing perspectives on what were the drivers of increased costs of disasters and hazards, why the thesis of adaptation and resilience is important, really with the goal of helping people understand both the opportunities and challenges in this space. So it is an independent media publication of our work, and our goal is to really help anybody in a position that is likely in an industry impacted by climate risk, but doesn't really have the language yet to say adaptation and resilience, to highlight, hey, here's what's happening, here's why, here are some examples of other places or communities that have been able to invest in how they adapt or how they de-risk. And so ultimately, we think of this as an effort to help people understand that risk is material, that there are solutions that exist, and that resiliency should become a lens in which we design new financial systems and infrastructure.
When we did our kind of initial talk before this interview, you talked about that fact that the problem isn't that we don't have resilient technologies or solutions. It's about the financing, which Monika and I talk about a lot. We cite to NIBS and their return on investment for resiliency. But yeah, tell us more about that challenge and why you think there's still such a challenge with the financing for resiliency.
Yeah, great question. There's a couple things at the heart of why this is a challenge. So, one is that we really haven't had to do this before. We had a stable climate for 12,000 years. If you're familiar with the work of Probable Futures, they have a really fantastic series of primers and maps that demonstrate how, climate risk is increasing, what it looks like in different places, and then connecting the dots for, well, how is this going to manifest in our infrastructure and the way in which we built society, from sewage systems to how we do kids sports events, to extreme heat, to how we've built school buildings to handle a certain amount of, heat and AC. All of these challenges are starting to manifest itself in communities differently. And that's relatively new in the past, 10 to 20 years, and it's only going to get worse. So one, this isn't something we've had to do before. And I think you look at, the insurance market as a great signal of how this risk is increasing. Insurance and weather models were relatively predictable for a while, and now they're not. And we're seeing that start to get priced in to, different things. So that's kind of one thing at the challenge is we haven't had to build this muscle yet as a society. The second thing that we know and recognize is the NIBS study is, the manifestation of this, which is adaptation and resilience is, and the climate risk is shared everybody's problem, but really no one's job to fix when you have so many co-beneficiaries. So a lot of our work with financing is trying to recognize, well, who is winning and losing with this risk? And how do we bring capital off the sidelines that might not traditionally be included in solving the problem into the conversations? Like, we're kind of raising our hands saying, this is everybody's problem, no one's job. Let's make it our job to connect some of the dots and stakeholders. So you think about who holds a lot of the risk, it's state and local governments. They are the place-based institutions that are, responsible for communities. And they also have, budgets around to do that and some financial instruments for how to do that with, raising bonds, et cetera. But they cannot shoulder the burden alone. And especially in a world with, changing federal policy around, money flowing into communities before or after a disaster, private companies and commercial real estate as an example, and homeowners that have 30-year mortgages in places. We're starting to think about how can we be creative about bringing some of that capital together so that this is something we can all work towards and frankly align incentives towards doing it.
That sounds like a lot of for good action, right? Referring back to the organization that got this started. I'm a big fan of the NIBS mitigation safe study, which you referred to. So we'll make sure we put the link to that study too. You mentioned you have studied the flow of money after a disaster. Can you share your findings? What's the flow of money after a disaster?
This is ultimately what led to resiliency at the center of our work, was seeing how money flows after a disaster is not durable. It's not aligning to an outcomes, and it's certainly not flowing into a way that is setting us up for a world with increasing risk. So it used to be that, a disaster would happen. We'd say it's, 1 in 100 years, and we would rebuild exactly what was there before. We can no longer do that. Risk is only increasing. And so that's ultimately why we said, all right, we need to rebuild differently with resilience. Some of the ways in which, money flows post-disaster is one thing to highlight is that these findings and this flow of funds is very disparate. Like how to connect the data pieces. We did a project with Candid, Giving Tuesday, and Network for Good, aligning all of our data to figure out, hey, can we track the flow of funds from giving and philanthropy? That data project alone was wildly challenging. But there's still some really great research that has informed, how money flows after a disaster. So the first one is that money flows in fast in the relief phase, but slows dramatically in the long-term recovery, probably to no one's surprise. The rough stat is that 80 to 90% of charitable donations that come in after a disaster go to those immediate needs, food, water, temporary shelter, and come within the first 6 weeks of a disaster. So what that means is your curve is big and then it really drops off. It's really, when you think about the durability of how that money flows out, by the time the community is left to recovery, and it takes an average of 6 years for a community to recover, a lot of those funds have already been depleted. So that durability isn't there. So 80% of those philanthropic dollars are spent almost immediately, but true recovery, happens in years 2 through 6. The other thing that we know is that government and corporate funds for rebuilding are slow and often have bureaucratic delays. I think that there's some really interesting stats around the average time that it takes for FEMA and insurance to come in. And a lot of times the full extent of the claims and the money that flows in is not totally known or understood by the homeowners or communities, months and even years afterwards.
On that point too, I've learned from kind of some personal experiences that, I am very privileged, both obviously being a homeowner, which I know is harder and harder for folks these days, but also even just having credit cards, right? Like the ability to, if God forbid a disaster would happen, I do have the resources to move into a hotel if I have to, or pay for some sort of temporary kind of housing and use my credit cards, knowing that hopefully eventually maybe I'll get reimbursed by insurance or yes, federal money. For a lot of people, they do not have that luxury. And I think about that now all the time about like if you don't have kind of that short-term access to cash, the idea that insurance or the federal government will come in later to reimburse you or help you out really doesn't mean anything if you're basically plunged into homelessness or all kinds of other awful things. If wherever you're living, be it your own home or a place you're renting, is destroyed for whatever reason. And so I don't know. I know you've talked about like that short-term relief. I know Red Cross and other groups are great with kind of helping out in that very short term. But like, is there anything for the longer term for these people as they are waiting to kind of fill in that gap between, all right, here we put up tents for 2 weeks after a flood or a hurricane, but you're not really going to get insurance or FEMA money for 6 months. Is there anything to help out those people who don't have the ability to kind of cover those short-term expenses?
Yeah, the short-term expenses, and I'd even say like the visibility and the access to where those funds come from is wildly complex to navigate. I think one of the stats is that 45% of, Americans can only afford a $400 expense from their checking and savings. A lot of wealth is tied up in homes. And so when you think about kind of like the impact that a disaster can have on all of the expenses that are adding up, where do you pull from? I mean, that is a fantastic role for philanthropy. And we know multiple studies that direct aid to folks is one of the most helpful things that you can do in the relief and short-term recovery phase. But most dollars, most philanthropic giving go to a narrow set of large organizations. So when we think about how that money flows out, and some of which the decisions and systems are made on how you access those funds, I can tell you from watching things unfold in Los Angeles, it is not clear. And the networks and systems for people to find out where to go in that, phase is not clear.
Yeah, that's a whole nother challenge trying to figure out how to access this money, which I know just for all kinds of government money, grants, funding, whatever, is a constant challenge. All right, first, I actually did interrupt you. I have some more follow-up questions, but I wanted to make sure that we didn't miss any other points that you were addressing regarding the flow of money after a disaster, because I kind of interrupted you.
I think we hit everything. The thing that I will, really emphasize that is core to, the role of rebuilding after a disaster and the importance of resiliency is that this is not the way that because we haven't had to finance, in new and different ways, we could just rebuild what was there before. This requires a new system for financing, and it's not the way that money flows now. So insurance money cannot pay for any extra resiliency work. FEMA and federal aid, philanthropy is not set up to do anything above what was there before. So kind of the biggest, I think, aha moment and thing that we're really focused on are what are the ways in which we can ensure the funding and financing gap, not just that there's money for the long-term recovery, but that knowing that long-term recovery building back to what was there is insufficient. We need to have a larger bar for funding and financing of that.
Yeah, and that's the destroy, rebuild, repeat climate disaster cycle, right? That we've talked about a little bit on our podcast, Monica, but we haven't gotten into it great detail. But that is part of the problem because of all the different rules and regulations and insurance policies. Even if people wanted to leave a community, which is also hard. I mean, you can know that you're going to have natural disasters, but it's a hard ask for people to say, I'm going to move away from family, friends, everything I love. But even if people are willing to move, it's often much harder, I think, than people realize. When you're like, well, why do you keep rebuilding there? Why don't you just leave that hurricane-prone area? There's so many obstacles to doing that.
Abby, and you allude to the fact that there is a gap, right, between like building back the same to building back resiliently. Is the Resiliency Company helping that gap? And if yes, how?
Yeah. So after the fires in LA are a great example, which is, we're about to rebuild anywhere between 11 and 12,000 homes, 16,000 structures. And if we look at that at the home level, one of the things to know is that we actually have the technology and solutions, the building materials, the ways to architect homes to be safer from wildfire. It's called the Institute for Building Home and Safety, IBHS, Wildfire Prepared and Wildfire Prepared Plus standard. Engineers, architect, and the insurance industry has actually all gotten together and say, we need to make sure that we can do this. And those standards exist, but it costs more to build a home with these extra building materials and enhancements than it does without it. So that is a gap, a funding and financing gap. So we've created the Resilient Delta Fund to cover that difference for homeowners, to make sure that if they decide to rebuild, it can be done to the IBHS wildfire, prepared plus standard. And the goal with that, by funding and financing that gap, is that we know that there's going to be value in the home, in the fact that it is more likely to be insured. Also there's a version of how we can build homes to withstand hurricane and heavy winds. It's called the IBHS fortified standard. And there's some really interesting research coming out of that if you have a fortified roof and a fortified home, your home value increases 7 to 8% by having that on there. So we have decided to say, all right, if the North Star is every home in Los Angeles that we are rebuilding, let's make sure it is built for the new world of a fire resilient insurable standard. We need to provide widespread access to solve the problem for making sure that gets paid for, and then focus on the education, awareness, resources for who the contractors and folks are to do this work. So that's been a really critical component of our response to the fires in Los Angeles, and believe that this is a great model that we can then take to other communities that are recovering from a disaster, that are thinking about rebuilding, to ensure that what gets rebuilt is done so to a resilient insurable standard, is by fixing that financing and funding gap first, and then working with the community on education and storytelling about why this is important.
I have to mention, speaking of IBHS, even though I live in the Midwest, we can obviously have wildfires. Right now, today, we're dealing with the smoke from the Canadian wildfires. So wildfires are a worry here too. And I'm obsessed now with IBHS. And yeah, there are different wildfire protections. We actually spoke to Dr. Ann Cope from the IBHS. She was our, I think, final episode of season 1. So if anyone is interested, they should go back and check out that episode, because we talked to her about some of the different things you can do, which I love.
Can I add one thing that I forgot to mention that we'll send you all a link for? So Headwaters Economics, along with Insurance for Good, Carolyn Kuski, who I think has been a guest, did a study about the actual cost to rebuild to the IBHS wildfire prepared, standard. And so one of the things that we know is that the best, most affordable time to build with resilience is when you're doing a newer rebuild. Retrofitting a home is very challenging, but this is kind of the best time to do it. It's the most, economical. And so that report shows that if in Los Angeles, the cost of rebuilding and covering that delta is about $200 million in investment, that it will save future avoided losses of, hold on, I'll find the number. I should have this off of the top of my head because it is so powerful. Saves 40 billion in future avoided losses. So 200 million now for, 40 billion in future avoided losses.
That's a crazy ROI.
Yeah.
Yeah, please send us a link. That sounds great, and we'll include it on the notes for sure.
And I think that brings up your point again, talking about, the best time to build and the resilience is during either a new build or retrofit or repair. But that also goes back to like the charitable donations. And you talked about, some of that direct funding that comes in immediately after disaster. Have you been tracking like what does happen when I donate to Red Cross, after a disaster or something? I know that it's probably going to, again, that immediate help, food, shelter, clothing. But what does happen for the longer term? Like, are these donations all going to individuals? Are there any funds, any charitable donations anyway, that are going to just help the broader community deal with recovering from a disaster?
I wish that I had a very concrete answer for you. It's like one of the quests that we went on and recognized that this tracking is fragmented. There's no unified public system for tracking where charitable disaster donations go. And then a lot of times, funds can obscure the ultimate recipients. Even hovering up all that information through 990s is challenging. And the direct to survivor support is rare, but there are new models that are popping up and do that. Likely you have multiple intermediaries and, the grassroots organizations that are ultimately a lot of times on the ground working on the long-term recovery with things like mental health support services, food access, short and medium term housing. That's where a larger bucket of money through, public dollars tend to go towards. There's some really interesting ideas coming out of, California Forward and Climate Resolve and a couple other organizations that are really advocating for the idea of setting up resilience districts after a disaster so that there can be a sustainable revenue model for rebuilding with resilience and taking care of the ongoing maintenance required to keep a place resilient through things like tips and new, taxation methods. So, I think that, like I said, we have to build the muscle to rebuild differently. I think you'll see some new innovative models that allow for that isn't just dependent on philanthropy, because that is such a fragmented space of knowing where, the money ultimately went.
Abby, you mentioned charity alone won't solve infrastructure. What kinds of infrastructure are you referring to, and how does the Resiliency Company help align the capital, policy, and the community to actually move the needle and make a difference?
Great question. So we have practices across residential, commercial, and public community infrastructure. And when I think about our work, we ultimately have kind of two goals with that. One is to tell the story about adaptation, resilience, and risk, and why this is inbound for all asset classes, for all infrastructure types. And then the second thing is to create conditions for success. So, because we haven't had to finance this way before, sometimes that means creating new models. And the example of the Resilient Delta Fund is a good example of, for residential infrastructure, how can we make sure that homes are built to a more resilient standard at scale? And so the Delta Fund is kind of an answer to, here's how we can do that after a disaster when the time is, the most affordable and has the highest ROI. And ultimately, like, our goal with the Delta Fund is not just that we do this in times of disaster and in a couple markets, but that we demonstrate how every financial institution across the country should be doing resilient home lending. That's not the case right now. You can't walk into your, local bank and say, hey, I want to take out a home to build a fortified roof. Awareness, education, and funding and financing. So we're really trying to focus on that as an example of capital policy and community infrastructure of a model of success. And then we're also working on what models of success are required in commercial and public infrastructure as well.
I love that idea. Is that a charity I can go donate to, or how does that get funded?
Yeah, we're actively fundraising for the Delta Fund. And it is because the North Star is widespread access of, every home needs to be built to a more resilient standard. We're raising both grants and loans. So the call to action is, if you are, a philanthropic supporter, we're looking to get grants to homeowner, like low and moderate homeowners, to rebuild to this resilient standard. If you are a financial institution or an investor, we have a loan product with, returns, and it's kind of your large TAM and SAM lending capacity product that, ultimately we're bringing to market. So that's the best way to support it. As well as, one of the things that strikes me is, it's not wildly surprising, which is the fact that we have standards to build homes differently. So having, knowing that you can ask your contractor, your developer, your architect, anybody that is thinking about what a home build requires, like, ask about these standards and get them baked in.
Okay, well, now I have two more follow-up questions after that. First, and we talk a lot about homeowners too. And obviously, when you're a homeowner, you have a lot more control. Still not total, depending on, most of us do not have unlimited funds, but you can fortify your home possibly in different ways, all of that. What about, have you focused at all on those who are renting, right? Like, is there the same motivation for a landlord, for example, to build back with resiliency? Or is there really not that same incentive for them? And so therefore the people who live in those apartments, again, often don't have a choice. They're like, well, I can't afford to move into a more resilient apartment because I'm limited income. So have you looked at that and the different kind of motivations, I guess, in that market?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of things that we're actively doing now and will continue to do, which is we try to center the work of the Delta Fund and of the Resiliency Company in this example, the homeowner journey or a journey map of if you step back and think we are not in the business of originating loans. Like that's not why we were created. We're in the business of trying to influence decisions to be made about what gets built. The renter is tough because they're a couple steps removed from what gets built. So we are all about how can we provide education, awareness, and funding and financing for the ultimate decision maker on what asset gets built. And so that could be, the land and homeowner, that could be a commercial real estate fund, that could be, or a real estate fund, that could be a, general contractor or builder that is saying, hey, I'm, going to build this house and know that I can sell it for this. We're making the case that like borrow a little bit more because it will have ROI down the line.
All right, I like that. And that does cross over. I mean, this is also why sometimes you just need building codes, for example, right? For those
Oh,
individuals who aren't motivated to build back better. The building codes are there, but then this also brings in the tension. And Monica and I talk about this sometimes. To me, like there's three things that always need to be considered. One, obviously, still is sustainability to the extent possible. And sometimes sustainability and then resiliency, the second part, those can be intentions. Sometimes there's actually great overlap. And I feel like more and more we're seeing, ways that you can be both resilient and sustainable, which is great. But then the other part of this, of course, is affordability. If you can build the most sustainable, resilient house in the world, but if nobody besides the billionaires can afford it, who cares? So yeah, so it sounds like a lot of the work you're doing is in that part to help both make the business case for the affordability here and to help provide the funding to make this an option that's affordable for more people. Is that fair?
yeah, exactly. A good example right now is, in Los Angeles and going to a community after a disaster is, things are going to be built and you kind of have the idea of community collective action can almost be baked in. So if you know that, we have a mass adoption of multiple homeowners that want to rebuild with resilience, we can do things like shared purchasing agreements on driving down the prices of building materials instead of ad hoc one by one making decisions. So how can we use customer consumer demand to help drive what is ultimately more innovation and affordability? The other flag that I will share around, accessibility, affordability, and also there's an element of culture and beauty that cannot be left out of the argument. There's a great program called Case Study Adapt that, came out of Los Angeles, and it's resurrecting the case study program of building these homes that essentially launched mid-century modern architecture back in the 60s. So they resurrected this concept and are partnering with 10 world-renowned architects to build resilient homes to demonstrate how culture can incorporate resilience and beauty and design. We don't have to live in concrete boxes like Mad Max style here. These are things that you can still bring in, beautiful aesthetic and designs while building and optimizing for resilience.
I'm sure the eyes of the architects listening are widening. Culture and beauty are very important for sure. And there are certain things that we cannot miss as time goes on, right? And we have to conserve. There's part of the culture for sure. You are collaborating with the Urban Land Institute and Jones Lang LaSalle on a climate risk playbook for real estate. Both Jessica and I contributed to it. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, this came out of some early conversation during my strategic discovery conversations. Joe Raz from Ryan Companies. I sat next to him at a Chamber of Commerce event about what building resilience means. And we ended up sitting next to each other at lunch. And I asked him the question, hey, you're in commercial real estate. We're focused on, making sure that commercial real estate integrates more resilience, into decision making. How should we do this? And he said, Well, there needs to be alignment on all of the stakeholders throughout the life cycle of an asset on who holds the risk and who's responsible for the decision. And I go, yeah, does that exist? He goes, nope. So that was one of the projects that we said, you know what, this is definitely within the charter of our work in terms of telling the story about how and why de-risking and building with resilience has ROI and creating conditions for success. So as somebody, as an organization that's dedicated to resilience and nothing else, it brought 40 different stakeholders and a broad group of collaborators together to align on, let's track the life cycle of a new commercial real estate building. How do decisions get made? Who holds the risk and why? And who is responsible for making the resilience decisions? Because if you get to the end of, a new asset, owner, tenant who is responsible for the next 30, 50, 100 years of that, and they've had no input on the decision and hold all the risk, and insurance rates keep changing and changing, but they haven't built for that. You just have a mismatch of where the decisions are and where the risk is. So that's the goal of this playbook. And I'm really excited ultimately as a way to just demonstrate, here's what the process looks today, and here's some opportunities for aligning incentives. We are doing this work ultimately because not only do we want to change process and bring some awareness to, hey, the system isn't designed for a world of increasing risk, we're also hoping that some new financial models for incentives for building with resilience can start getting baked into that system, because the holders of risk and the investors in the project recognize we should take a beat, fund that gap to include resilience measures and de-risking measures into our RFP process, so that, insurance rates don't keep going up and up at the end.
That's fantastic. It's so needed. I think we need to insert applause sound on the recording. After spending years researching, implementing, pushing for, advocating for resilience in the real estate industry, I think this is really needed. And I can't wait for it to come out. I think it'll be released in New York City Climate Week. Isn't that right?
It will. So that's where we're going to do kind of the unveiling and hoping for some feedback too of practitioners, of the folks along that process map to know, how do they respond to it? How do they think of it? And ultimately, one of our paths toward this is we want feedback on it. We want people to use it and give ways in which, the theory and strategy might break down. And ultimately then come and submit examples of how you built buildings with resilience. That's something that I think our future work wants to highlight and, award, so that we can start figuring out some of the financial incentives to do that as well. So that will ultimately be like a come give us feedback and then tell us your story of how you changed, how you built something to include resilience, because we want to tell that story of ROI.
That's super smart, because also there's many reports out there that have a lot of good information, but not the right folks that need to read it, or they may not be implemented. Like there has to be, these reports have to exist or guidelines have to exist, but then also there needs to be follow-up, implementation of feedback, quantification of action, etc.
Exactly.
Well, and I like the way you talk about this is really a new muscle we all have to build in any industry. In my industry, the law, I certainly see it in construction. There's just kind of this mentality that's baked in because we all learn from our elders and from those with experience before us that this is how we always do things. And just like AI is disrupting many industries, including my own, climate change is doing the same. And you see it really first and foremost in the built environment, which is what Monica and I are so passionate about. So I love this idea of, yes, just having to build this muscle of approaching the entire process differently. I think that's great. Beyond everything you've already said, do you have any other general advice for people who are involved in the real estate industry for dealing with climate adaptation besides building their climate muscles?
Yeah. My advice tends to be very pragmatic, which has to do with influencing the decision for where we can insert understanding risk, understanding that risk is material, and where and how we design for it. So a really concrete example for folks in real estate, wherever you are in the value chain, is understanding the role that the RFP process is in how we decide like what gets built and who builds things, whether that's just asking a question. How do you plan on dealing with climate risk? You don't even have to say climate risk. You can say physical risk, right? Flooding, and each place has a different set of risks. There are plenty of tools from, Aon and Marsh and insurance tools to know here's how to quantify that risk. And here's actually how to make sure you're solving for it. And that just asking that question, bringing some awareness for how are you going to plan to this is one of those things that I believe in real estate will start to percolate into this is something that we value. This is a lens that we are looking for. And this is therefore then a practice and something we need to solve for. Because then making the case for why this isn't just like a value cost bid. This is a solution, a collaboration, a partnership for what is going to maintain the durability of that asset over a long period of time where risk is increasing and relatively unknown, but we can solve for it. How do we make that? So that's kind of like my new tactical, pragmatic think about how asking a question about risk and resilience can be in the RFP process and involve insurance in that. Insurance and brokers are actually sitting there saying, I don't want to just bind coverage at the end when you've already built it. Let me help drive a decision on how to de-risk this asset because we want to keep writing policy.
That's great. That makes me think of, you're probably familiar with the ASTM Property Resilience Assessment. It was a standard that was built last year, maybe it was completed. And, folks from the finance field and insurance field, they were all involved in this standard. So I'm sure that will be mentioned at some point in the climate risk playbook for real estate.
Standards and building codes really help give the clarity and consistency that I think we need for other markets to play and have a level of confidence that we've done something differently.
That's great. Just to finish up our great episode, how can people get involved with the Resiliency Company?
Yeah, thanks for asking. So you mentioned the Epicenter. I recommend, going to epicenterinsights.com and subscribing where we do, newsletters and publications ranging from coverage on insurance and public markets and what's driving costs of disasters. And here are some opportunities to get involved in innovation. So subscribing to the Epicenter, following along our work, both with me and the company on LinkedIn. That's where we tend to post information about progress on these initiatives and how to access things like the climate risk playbook when it launches and updates with the Delta Fund, the Resilient Delta Fund. And, know that we aim to serve in a role as connective tissue for sectors and industries that can't do this alone, nor are they expected to. So how we can help connect some dots on insurance and commercial real estate in the non-traditional way for how they act together, and just ask some questions on switching around the process and helping build that muscle. So if there are opportunities where a sector, an organization, or a company sees a problem with climate risk in physical risk to the built environment and says, I want to try something different, give us a buzz.
That's great. And how about donations, or maybe an investor that after listening to this episode is just eager to provide some funds? Where do they go?
Investment in the Resilient Delta Fund is one of the most high impact ways to get involved in the thesis. And then donations to the Resiliency Company. We are a 501c3, although we try not to act like one. Information can be found on our website on how to donate and support the mission. Ooh, can I give one more plug that I forgot?
Please
Probable
do.
Futures. Probable Futures is another, they are a fiscally sponsored project of the Resiliency Company. They are one of, the most high impact ways to help with climate literacy and help stakeholders understand the implications of risk and climate risk and adaptation. So they're also a nonprofit, and donation information is available on their website to help support climate literacy.
We will post a link to that website as well. I'd not heard of that until you mentioned it today. I also have to give a shout out just before we wrap up here. The Epicenter, I see that the main story right now is about the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewer District. I actually just presented with one of the engineers from there, and he has promised me a tour of the sewer district, which I'm very excited about. As everyone knows, I'm a big fan of sewer systems. I'm like really God bless the modern sewer system. So I think that's great. I appreciate your support too for infrastructure. We were actually presenting at a conference to all civil engineers dealing with stormwater, water, and sewer systems throughout the Midwest. And, most of the engineers there understood the need to incorporate resiliency, but they, like everybody else, are facing the same challenge of like, where do we get the money for this, right? And depending on your state and local government, there's more or less funding for those kind of things. And of course, now the federal funds for all of this may be drying up. So it's a real challenge. And unfortunately, it's going to become more challenging right now, even as the climate change issues get worse. But I'm glad you're highlighting that. Thank you for that. Thank you so much, both for talking to us and for this work you're doing. I think it's filling a much needed gap and giving us a bigger, broader overview. And you've got so many resources, which again, that is why we love talking to people like you. So that way our audience knows that there is a lot of information out there. There are solutions and technologies and all that sort of thing. And we just need to make sure everybody is aware. So thank you so much.
Thank you. This was awesome.
Thanks for listening to Adapt: Climate Change and the Built Environment. We hope you enjoyed this episode and come back to hear more of our conversations with people leading the way and addressing the issues facing the built environment as our climate changes. Please rate, review, and subscribe, and share our podcast with others who may be interested. And if you have any feedback or suggestions for topics or guests for future seasons, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at adaptthebuiltenvironment@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.